Okay, good afternoon and welcome to Wednesday or Thursday seminar rather, COVID-19 and the Insurers response, our latest October update. Welcome, Mr. Sharp.
Hello, Julie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
As you know, Julie, I've had a bit of a family emergency, so we're recording this on Thursday because I won't be actually to be physically there tonight. So apologies to everyone who's listening to me, and I'm sorry I can't be there. But as Julie will say at the end, I'm very happy to answer any questions. Please do email me at jonsharp@silverllp.com with any questions, and I'll give you my undertaking to answer them as soon as I possibly can. So there we are. There we go, Julie.
Okay, so without any further ado then, John, let's begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie. Evening, ladies and gentlemen. COVID-19 and the insurers response. I've been doing this seminar now really since March. I know that people will be anxious to have the latest update about the FCA case, but I am going to go through the full slides. There'll be many people who haven't been on this tour before, and I think it contains some important information, especially with regard to force majeure and what people should be doing now, because I'm still not seeing very much evidence that people are putting provisions in their contracts which will cover this sort of event going forward. So that's me. Less said about him, the better. He's on the website, etc. So this seminar addresses insurance issues generally. Everyone's policies will differ. More about that later. It's as accurate as it can be given the still rapidly changing situation. And I'm afraid I can't address specific situations. My advice has always been speak to your broker, speak to your lawyer or other advisor. In terms of agenda, we're going to look at acts of God, general information about the virus, office policies, force majeure, frustration, the insurance market's approach, mitigation and site closure, travel insurance, recent developments, and the FCA business interruption insurance test case. First thing to be clear, and I think everyone now knows this virus is not an act of God. The possible causes were consumption of animals outside the food chain. And of course, there are a number of conspiracy theories, all of which have been encouraged by a lack of cooperation by the Chinese authorities to have an independent inquiry into what happened, despite the fact that countries from all over the world have called for one. It suffices to say that there is an increasing lobby now that says this virus was actually man-made, and the longer the resistance from the Chinese government goes on to having an independent inquiry, that's only likely to gather momentum. But the current law is set out the decision of Lord Hobhouse, Transco plc against Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council. Lord Hobson described an act as God as an event which involved no human agency, was not realistically possible to guard against, is due directly and exclusively to natural causes, and could not have been prevented by any amount of foresight, plans, and care. A classic example is probably in relation to shipping, where you will have a port that has not had any problems with flooding, etc., for 120 years, and suddenly you'll get a freak tide, freak combination of circumstances, which means that the port floods. That is a classic act of God. So the virus itself, what's known about it? Well, still remarkably very little, though they seem now to be working on a cure for it. At first it was thought that it would give the Atwell heat, well it does. Alcohol, that was another one. Gave everyone excuses to go and stock up on vast amounts of alcohol, but no, it doesn't seem to make any difference either. In terms of measures, well, all governments have been consistent in their responses: containment, delay, mitigation. However, no government, it is fair to say, no matter where they were in the world, prepared for this virus, despite warnings. There's a link there to a speech that George Bush gave in 2005 after the SARS outbreak. And it's interesting when you listen to what he says, because he regards it as when, not if. And therefore you would have thought that governments would, for example, have had stockpiles of PPE, etc. But no government did, and therefore we were wholly unprepared for it. And George Bush wasn't the only person to give warnings, others have as well. And when you think that we had SARS in 2002 to 2005, MERS 2009 to 2012, and a couple of nasties in the middle, then, you know, possibly we should have paid a bit more attention to what history was teaching us. Now, insurance policies in general, again, I bang on about this, but I still don't think people sometimes get it. There are two things you get with an insurance policy if you arrange it through a broker. A broker will send you a summary of the cover that he has arranged. He will send it, and it'll be about 4 pages long. So here's ours. This is our cover note for our office contents and things. And employer's liability. It's all wrapped into one policy. Yeah, it's called a business combined policy. Now, this policy schedule, I can assure you, is 4 pages long. No more than that, and it looks wonderful. In there's lots of limits as to what we can claim for, what we can't claim for. We can claim up to 100,000 for this and 1 million for that. Marvelous stuff. But it's not my contract with my insurance company. The policy wording is. Now, the policy wording, again, this is ours, that goes with that cover note is some 62 pages long of very small, narrow print, containing exclusions, different clauses, exclusions, exemptions, rules as to when you can apply for payment, when you need to notify your insurers, a whole raft of quite detailed clauses, all of which, unfortunately, are your contract between you and your insurer. So your cover note only identifies the main terms of your policy. It is not your contract with your insurance company. Your policy wording, this is your contract with your insurance company. It needs careful reading every year by the responsible officer in your company to ensure that it meets your company's requirements. If it doesn't meet your company's requirements, you need to go back to your broker and say, it looks great, but it's not covering us for this. And then the broker will sometimes arrange additional cover for you. You might have to pay a bit more premium, but at least you've got coverage. And also, if the nature of your business changes in any way throughout the year, including taking on new or unusual types of work, you need to update your underwriters. Your policy wording is a living document. And therefore, if you take on some unusual types of work during the course of the year, you need to tell your insurers. And they may well come back and say, well, no, that's fine, you're still covered. Or they might say, well, actually, you're not covered for that. We will cover you, but we want some more money. Most people just put it in the top drawer and never look at it again. That's not the correct approach. So was there cover if you need, when we were all told to leave our offices? Well, it depends whether you had what's called passive cover or intervention cover. Let me give you an example of intervention cover. So you're operating a fish and chip shop and you've opened it up in an area where there are no other fish and chip shops. And you've invested in some nice new fat fryers and you're doing lovely crispy chips. You've got a good batter recipe and you're actually doing very well. But unfortunately, one of your fat fryers develops a fault through no fault of anybody's, and unfortunately causes a fire, and you're out of your premises for 3 months. Now, any form of policy will cover you for the fire. Insurers will say, that's fine, no problems, we'll send people around to fix your property. That's fine. But even the most basic business interruption policy would pay you some money for the time that your business is not operating. It may be based on your turnover, it might be based on your loss of profit, but that basic cover would be there. Now, that is in even the most basic policies, but you could buy policies which covered you for what are called non-intervention events, passive cover. And classically, and what we've been concerned about recently, notifiable diseases and acts of government which effectively exclude you from your premises. So it depends which type you've got, but you need to look at your policy wording to see. There are, of course, and I always will stress this, there will be limits on your policy and you will still have to prove your loss. Long gone are the days where you could say to your insurance company, oh, that's cost me £200, and they would pay it. No, they will want some evidence of your loss. And it will be particularly true going forward in relation to business interruption claims with regard to COVID-19, that you will need to prove your loss in some detail. Now let's have a look at force majeure and frustration in the next couple of slides. It's not directly relevant to insurance, but it is worth noting, it's worth listening, I think, what I'm saying here, because as I said earlier, I'm still not seeing contracts being amended to include a proper force majeure clause. So we have to accept that coronavirus has undoubtedly caused delay to contractual obligations. And if a contract contains a force majeure clause, that excuses one or both parties for performance under the contract if certain events occur. Now, force majeure has no fixed interpretation in English law, so each case will be individually considered by the courts unless the circumstances are specifically set out within the contract, within the force majeure clause. Now, lots of contracts, the JCT being an obvious one, simply say unless force majeure applies. Well, yeah, you'll all be going off to court to find out what that means. However, if you've got a contract and it says force majeure covers this, much easier. And businesses who think they could be affected by the pandemic going forward, and we are certainly not out of the woods yet, should check that the force majeure clause in contracts covers the circumstances that we currently find ourselves in. And in particular, when entering into new contracts, you must consider whether to include a force majeure clause appropriate to the type of business locations in which your company is operating, so that reference is made specifically to pandemics and epidemics. So the clause should also include potential government reactions to outbreaks such as quarantine measures in large cities and the closure of public transport, which might prevent company employees from coming to work and thus prevent the performance of the parties' obligations. Shipping contracts are very, very good at defining what force majeure events are. So, for example, that covers acts of government authorities, acts of princes and rulers. Shipping contracts are the oldest. And import and export bans, restrictions on availability of goods, that's all in shipping contracts, force majeure clauses. Now is the time to make sure when you're going forward and negotiating new contracts, you have a decent force majeure clause in there. So the contract should also say what happens if a force majeure event arises. So you've defined your force majeure events, but then you need to go on and say, and in the event that force majeure applies, this is what's going to happen to the contract. Because your only other option is to apply to the court under what's called the doctrine of frustration. And where there is no applicable force majeure clause, another avenue might be to invoke the doctrine of frustration. That is that a contract may be brought to an end when something unforeseen occurs after the formation of the contract through no fault of either party that has the effect of making it commercially or physically impossible to perform the contract. Whilst it might be possible to argue that the pandemic has frustrated the contract, the courts are often unwilling to find that a contract has been frustrated, because the problem with frustration is that it terminates the contract permanently. Both parties are excused from the contract. It would therefore be much better when you're drafting your new contracts that you put in a force majeure clause which specifically refers to events such as pandemics, rather than trying to use general law principles such as the doctrine of frustration. So what was the insurance market's approach generally to COVID-19? Well, I think we all know now it didn't come to our aid in our hour of need. It worked its hands of everything and said, COVID-19 has got nothing to do with us, nothing to see here. So what potential cover may you have in respect to the cancellation of contracts? Well, classically, your business interruption clauses. There are some policies that some people bought which covers delay in receipt of essential supplies. You can buy insurance policies for that. You need to look in your contractor's all risk cover to see if you've got any cover for this type of event. And obviously look at your office policies to see whether you have got cover for being excluded from your offices by the acts of government and local authority. Now, what will assist? Well, what did assist was the fact that coronavirus was declared a pandemic and a notifiable disease. However, that made no difference to insurers, who said that they argue that this outbreak was not within the reasonable contemplation of any party when they took out the insurance cover. And they went further and virtually immediately from probably mid to late Feb started to exclude any new policies, any cover whatsoever for COVID-19. And they have carried on excluding cover in relation to viruses, pandemics, notifiable diseases in just about every new insurance contract. So the reality means that you must have probably taken out your insurance policy lasting a year, probably before the end of January. After that, you may well find you have got an exclusion in there, excluding COVID-19, etc. Whereas if you compared the same policy a month earlier, you wouldn't have had such an exclusion. Now then, mitigation. If you are fortunate to have a policy that includes some kind of cover for pandemics and notifiable diseases and acts of government, then you still have a duty to what's called mitigate your loss. This means that you can't just close your office and walk away. Even if you have got passive office cover, as I mentioned earlier, you must wait until the government says you must close your office before you actually did so. In terms of business interruption as well, you must still continue to operate your business to the best of your ability. You cannot just simply say, we're covered, we're shutting up shop, that's it. It's not how it works. You must continue to operate your business to the very best of your ability in order to minimize the claim that you may be able to make in your insurance policy. Classic example of that is if you have a warehouse and your warehouse floods. Insurers do not expect you to leave items floating in the water. They expect you to salvage them. Now, they still may be ruined, don't get me wrong, but they're expecting you to at least salvage them so you may be able to obtain something in relation to the damaged goods. So when the loss adjuster comes round to warehouses which are flooded and he finds that there are boxes and boxes and boxes floating still in the water, he is not going to be impressed. If he comes and sees that you're doing everything you can, he will be very impressed and will urge insurers to be more cooperative. Next, notification. You must inform your insurers as soon as possible that you may be making a claim. Now, when I first did these slides at that stage, so back in March, April, it was probably too early to make any claims in your business policy because we didn't know how long it was going to last, and certainly you couldn't put any figures on it. However, now you can, but remember, you will need to be able to substantiate your claim with hard documented evidence showing that you have suffered some form of business interruption loss. You also need to communicate continually with your brokers and to ask them what you should be doing in the current circumstances, especially in the light of the FCA case, more about that later, and be guided and guarded by their advice as to what you can claim for and when you should be claiming it, when you should be notifying your insurers of a potential claim. The other thing about notification is that I'm afraid if you haven't notified your insurer that you are thinking about making a business interruption claim, it may well now be too late. Most policies contain a clause that says you must notify us of any potential claim within 30 days. Some are 60, but 30 days is normal. So you should have by now, if you think you're going to make a claim, have at least told your insurers. They may have said, well, there was no cover of the policy, to which you should be saying things like, well, actually, there's the FCA test case. We're putting you on notice and our rights are reserved. Yeah, because what you don't want to do, and I think if you were to make a business interruption claim as a result of COVID-19 now, you would be met with a very strong argument from underwriters to say, this is late notification. Where have you been for the last 6 months? You know, you knew about this, you should have made a claim earlier. The other important thing I think I should stress, because I found this out nearly to our cost, if you shut your offices or your sites, you must tell your insurers and keep them updated. Most policies contain a clause that say that cancels cover on premises and building sites if they're unoccupied or not worked on for a period of 30 days. So you must tell your insurers if your office is shut, etc. Travel insurance, I will mention this because it's still causing lots of issues. It's unlikely now that your travel insurance will cover cancellation or delays as a result of the coronavirus. Mine fortunately did, because I took it out in January, so I was okay. But if you are fortunate, like I was, to have a travel policy which would cover you for coronavirus cancellation before February time, do not under any circumstances voluntarily cancel your holiday flights, etc. Wait till the airline cancels your flights, and wait until the government advice from the FCO recommending not travelling to your particular destination is given. Do not do anything voluntarily, because insurers will say, in the absence of FCO in the absence of the FCO dictating to you that you can't go somewhere, then it was your decision to cancel and not something you were forced to by the government, in particular the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So just do bear that in mind going forward. As I said, virtually every travel insurance policy that's issued now will exclude coronavirus, or they say coronavirus is what's called an expected event. So it's something that's going to happen, and therefore they don't cover it. Okay? So what did happen? Well, what we know now from the FCA test case, which contains a very full chronology of all the events from the start of the government intervention in March, what the insurers did. It's clear that Rishi Sunak did have a meeting with insurers back in March, April, to which not many insurers went, but nevertheless they were. And he basically said to them, "You will do the decent thing, won't you?" Well, they didn't, did they, really? So there was some attempt by the government, at least at the start, to intervene and ask insurers to pay. The chairman of Lloyd's then waded in. Again, this was the March, April time, and he was encouraging those that worked in under the Lloyd's of London umbrella to pay claims in relation to pandemics, epidemics, etc., and business interruption claims. Now, he couldn't force, and he didn't try to, but he made it clear that he was expecting the market to respond to such claims. I'll come on to what the FCA did in the next slide. But increasingly, from about March, April, May time, barristers were now starting to look at insurers' responses. And well, the best opinion I found was that of Jeffrey Gruder QC of Essex Court Chambers, and his short article on this is on the website. And his view was that certainly where you had a business interruption clause which said if there is an outbreak of a notifiable disease within a 25-mile radius, he was very firmly of the view that cover should apply. And indeed, he has been proved to be correct on that. He said, and I think this is probably the best way of putting it, viruses do not operate in watertight compartments. They are everywhere. And you cannot say, and no one can say, that the virus is over in that corner of the room, but not in this corner of the room. It doesn't work like that with viruses. So outbreaks at your offices, well, there was such an appalling lack of track and trace back in February, March. Who knows how many people came to the office with a heavy cold, not feeling well. Certainly one of our members of staff was off for 4 or 5 days and said he had felt absolutely terrible. Chances are he may well have had COVID-19. So what did the FCA then decide to do about insurers' stance on business interruption in particular, which caused a huge amount of anger? I don't think I've ever seen so many newspaper column inches on the anger that it caused by insurers saying COVID-19 has got nothing to do with us. Well, the FCA decided that it would take action. The FCA, as you probably know, is the regulator of all financial entities within this country. So it regulates the banks, it regulates insurers, it regulates credit operators, etc., etc., etc. And the FCA hates two things. One, it dislikes uncertainty. It doesn't think it's right that if you have uncertainty in a financial market, therefore does something about it. Secondly, it likes to make sure that all its customers are seen to be treated fairly. This is the FCA's big mantra, their raison d'etre, if you like. And that is that they like to see customers treated fairly. And was this blanket response from insurers of COVID-19's got nothing to do with us treating customers fairly? Well, it got together with insurers. And this was the only part of this that was actually quite friendly. And they basically said, well, look, we don't like the uncertainty. The insurers said, we don't like the uncertainty either. And the FCA said, well, no, neither do we. So they got together and produced what's called a framework document, a copy of which you can see on the FCA's website. And they agreed a mechanism to take these cases before the courts and let the courts interpret the policy wordings. And in the end, it ended up with 27 policy wordings being taken to court, underwritten by, I think, 8 different insurers. And they became the defendants in the action. And the claimant was the FCA, effectively standing in the shoes of all the policy holders. But that was the last nice thing about it. They agreed a framework. They also agreed assumed facts. So it agreed what issues would be determined, but based on the assumed facts. In fact, I don't think anyone could argue that the facts cited by the court in the 165-page judgment was anything other than thorough and absolutely fair. There was a process, of course, for agreeing those assumed facts, but nevertheless, the case proceeded on the basis of, here are the assumed facts, here's the policy wordings, now what's the interpretation? Is there cover? And in the 2 areas, 1, notifiable disease, and 2, the acts of the government in closing offices. Now, the decision was given about 5 weeks ago now. It's 165 pages long and is a very thorough, but nevertheless complex analysis of these wordings. Now, what did the case mainly decide on? Well, there's hardly any law on this area, bizarrely, apart from one case, which is called the Orient Express case. And this was all to do with a hotel in New Orleans, which was damaged, physically damaged, by Hurricane Katrina when she swept through. Now, if you go back to my fish and chip shop analogy that I made earlier, you would have thought that the Orient Express hotels, having had physical damage occurring to their hotel, would be able to make a business interruption claim. But when it came to it, the court in that case held that no, it couldn't, because the court said, well, what business was there to interrupt? The whole of New Orleans was flooded. And people weren't allowed to go there, so business wasn't interrupted. That case was heavily relied on in the FCA test case by insurers, as you can imagine. But the court found that, in fact, that case had been decided wrongly. And had it come before the court today, would have been decided differently. So that case was distinguished by the court. Therefore, that left the door open for the court to decide that certainly in relation to some of the policies that they were looking at, that there was cover for either notifiable diseases or for the acts of government in closing offices. Now, did the FCA win hands down? Well, probably, they say they did, and they undoubtedly did. It's probably 75-25, if you're honest about it. One of the insurance companies, a company called Ecclesiastical, who had 3 policy wordings under examination, they walked away. There was found to be no cover in there at all. Contrast that with a company called Hiscox, who I think we've all probably heard of, who advertise wide coverage. Yes, you pay a higher premium, but wide coverage, and we pay all claims, etc. They didn't do quite so well. They were found to have got liability under at least, if not all, but the majority of their policies that were under examination. So what should you be doing now? Well, you should be digging out your policy wording and seeing if you have got any form of cover in any of your policies for diseases, outbreaks of notifiable diseases and acts of government. If you have, you need to get that out, put it to one side. And then also probably now start calculating what your loss is. Now you can speak to your broker about this. Policies do differ. Some policies do your losses based on turnover, others do it on loss of profit, others do it on those directly arising from the closure. So the classic example of that would be how many more bits of computer equipment we needed to buy for all our staff to make sure they could work from home. Yeah. So you need to be getting that out. But as I said, just put it to one side, because of course there was within the framework process an agreed framework for appeals. And surprisingly enough, companies like Hiscox, who announced within an hour of the decision being out that they were going to appeal, the FCA also appealed, and others have also appealed. So there was a couple of insurers who had 3 policies to be examined. One was found to have covered, the other 2 not. So there's a lot of appeals going on, and these are being expedited and they're leapfrogging the Court of Appeal. So they're going to the Supreme Court and they are being pushed through quickly. So I would have thought they will start hearing the cases certainly early November, with a view to having judgment by the end of November. It's only then will we get certainty. But there is no harm now in starting to prepare a document evidencing your losses. And as I said, there is certainly no harm in digging out your policy wordings and seeing if you've got cover for one of those 2 eventualities. If you have, then what I suggest you do when the House of Lords decision is out is that, because there is now a template to judge these policies against, whereas before there was very little, it should not now cost a great deal of money to go to a solicitor who can instruct a barrister and get an opinion on whether your policy wording is covered or not. See, the problem, ladies and gentlemen, is this: 27 wordings were looked at, and they were, without any shadow of doubt, covered the majority of the wordings that are out there. But there are still, in fact, another 70. There were, in fact, a total of 78. So there's still another 50, which will be slightly different from the 27 looked at, to be tested by the court. So there's going to be a few wrinkles along the way. However, insurers have been encouraged not to be uncooperative and to be more flexible, and see and deal in a sympathetic way with claims. Whether or not they will is a slightly different matter. But as I said, we won't get certainty until November. So start preparing now and be prepared at the end of November to spend a little bit of money. And I don't say it's going to be a lot. You should be able to get a counsel's opinion for maybe £1,000 on whether or not your policy has got cover. If it has, well, you know, it's certainly £1,000 well spent. So what is the net effect of all of this on us generally and the insurance market going forward? Well, I regret, ladies and gentlemen, that it is not good news going forward. Because of a review that Lloyd's carried out at the end of November, in relation to all, at the end of November 2018, in relation to all of its syndicates and whether or not they were writing business profitably, a number of those businesses in particular, a number of underwriters in particular in relation to special indemnity insurance pulled out. So we had a lack of capacity that always increases premiums. There were then some market-wide losses, hurricanes, catastrophes, 737 MAX, all of which meant that we entered what's called a hard market. Then, of course, there was Grenfell. And we all are awaiting the outcome of that, but insurers will have made huge reserves to cover, well, in respect of those who are ultimately found to have been responsible for the fire at Grenfell Tower. And add to that now the FCA test case, where certainly there is going to be some liability in relation to some policies. The effect on premiums is just that they are going to go through the roof in all areas. But I will say this now, in relation to professional indemnity insurance premium, the next few years are going to see dramatic rises in levels of cover and the cost of cover. So when I say levels of cover, I mean you will be paying far, far more for your policy for far, far less coverage. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, was all I was going to say. As I said, I'm very sorry I can't be with you this evening, but I will make sure that if you do wish to submit any questions, that I will do my very best to answer them as promptly as I can. Thank you as always for your attention. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks very much, John. And I will make sure that all questions that come in get forwarded to you and get the response that they require. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Julie.